Welcome back. If it wasn't apparent already, I've been having way too much fun making these shorts, just explaining little things. And if you're not subscribed to Containers from the Couch yet, you should because I'm posting them all there. We have a few more. You'll probably see more in the break throughout this week. But that's not what we want to talk about right now. Those are just for fun. Those are trying to teach you something short within a minute, and that's what we're going with. So right now we want to talk about GitOps. And Leonardo, thank you for joining us. You work over at Weaver, so tell us about yourself and what you're doing with GitOps over there.
Thank you, Justin, and thanks everybody for being here today and for watching. That was really funny videos, really for sure. I was laughing. So I'm principal partner solutions architect at WeaveWorks. At WeaveWorks, we basically coined the term GitOps, and that's basically what I want to talk to you about today, right? Like, and in one area specifically, how does GitOps help us work with hybrid Kubernetes, right? Which is kind of this new challenge that we're running into more and more often with organizations, right? So yeah, Justin, that's what we're here for today.
That's awesome, and I'm sure you go ahead and share your screen. We'll pull it in a minute.
All right, let me share it real
But
quick.
what WeaveWorks did originally with terming GitOps has come from a long time of just learning about infrastructure as code and CI/CD practices and how we should actually be doing this at a certain scale. And we say like, hey, you know what? At some level, just having the code in a repo isn't good enough, and running this one-off applies isn't good enough. And I'm sure you're going to dive into that, but I've been following GitOps as a term and as really a narrow focus on a very specific way that we want to manage infrastructure and manage applications that you at WeaveWorks have seen scale, that I've seen scale in other areas. And it's something that we want to promote more because it solves some problems that just traditional infrastructure as code and CI/CD doesn't solve.
Exactly. And you know, I think anything that abstracts complexity away, right? Anything that makes the lives of people easier is something that you really want to elaborate on. And what you talk about, because it's funny how WeaveWorks ran into or found WeaveWorks, right? Or defined the GitOps way of doing things, right? Was through operating Kubernetes in production, right, at scale. And this is all practices that came out of our own experience, reducing the effort in guaranteeing reliability, guaranteeing that keeping a production system operationally reliable is something that doesn't take huge amounts of people, doesn't take a PhD to get done, right? If we can abstract that complexity away, it's fantastic. But I think there's still some debate as to what GitOps is really all about, and that's kind of what I wanted to start us with, right? Because everybody talks about GitOps, and I think there's a lot of people out there that would still think that just having the declarative code in a repo and some form of CI/CD is already doing GitOps, and I think that's missing out on some of kind of like the key components that make GitOps something revolutionary, right? Something really unique. And there's this initiative that I encourage everybody that's interested in GitOps to kind of like follow and participate in, which is called the Open GitOps Project. And the Open GitOps Project is a project that was started by the GitOps Working Group. And the GitOps Working Group is an initiative that was started by the CNCF, the Cognitive Computing Foundation, precisely to like define the principles that govern what GitOps is really all about, right? So that everybody can understand, am I doing GitOps? Am I extracting the real value out of GitOps that I could be? Or am I missing out on some aspects of it, right? And to me, like if we look at these principles real quick, I think principle 3 and 4 are what clearly set GitOps apart from just traditional CI/CD, right? Because I mean, we were just looking at Terraform, right? Terraform is declarative. We all using Git, which is kind of like version. We have SHAs that identify every specific commit. But the fact that declared state is pulled automatically by agents running in a target environment, and it's interpreted and continuously reconciled is what really gives GitOps its true powers, right? Because you're abstracting away all the complexity of reaching that state, and you're guaranteeing that that state is consistent over time, right? And that has benefits in terms of reliability, in terms of scalability, right? And how you manage becomes a whole lot simpler. So I think it's very important for people to really get the full spectrum, like the full sense of what GitOps is all about as they look to basically apply these principles in their own organizations, right?
And I do think that, like, starting off with, we need to define this in 4 principles or some set of principles was really important to be able to let people know, like, GitOps is a very specific thing, and we want to make sure that you're getting the benefit of GitOps, but you need these things, and having declarative infrastructure as code is just step 1, right? Like, that's like, hey, this is the minimum bar to, like, get to this point, but, like, start there, and now we're going to go to, like, let's actually store that in Git in an immutable way, and, like, not everyone even makes it to step 2. We need to make sure that we bring people along for each one of these steps. And as you were mentioning, like, the continuously reconciled piece is a huge part of just, like, if my Terraform apply, it was 6 months ago, I have no guarantees that this apply is going to work today as it did 6 months ago, because a lot has changed in that 6 months. And so doing something continuously and making sure that we're constantly looking at that state and reconciling it with what do we want and what should it be. I'm not waiting 6 months to do an apply. I'm waiting a couple minutes or a poll or some, you know, other trigger to say, like, hey, we're going to do this as short of a time span as possible to make sure that this state doesn't deviate from what our code declares and what the infrastructure actually has.
Exactly. And it's funny because, you know, it's 4 principles, but I was very actively involved in the working group that defined these principles. Like, getting them to this level of simplicity was, like, really, really hard. Like, you have no idea how many back and forth, how many meetings with the community we had to go through to get them to this point where they're general enough while being specific enough to really kind of communicate how it should operate. So it was really fascinating, and I think that there's a lot of value in the community kind of having published this, and in organizations really adopting it, right? Yeah. So now that we understand kind of like these principles, and I encourage everybody to go to Open GitOps and learn more, I want to talk a little bit as to how Weave GitOps, which is our product, applies these principles kind of like to a Kubernetes environment, right? And Kubernetes is very, very much aligned, or it makes it simpler to reach this way of operating, right? Because it's already declarative. Like, you're working with manifests that are describing objects, right? You're not telling Kubernetes how to produce those objects. You're just describing the object. We're using Git so that every change produces a new unique version that is immutable. And with GitOps, which is our tool, it's constantly watching this repository, and it's introspecting the state of the runtime. So it will continuously apply whatever it has to do. It perform any action that it needs to do to reconcile when there's drift, right? And basically, when you deploy something new, there's your drift, right? The current state is no longer matching the desired state, right? So the cool thing about this, and kind of like we can start thinking about this hybrid use case that we're going to talk kind of like more in depth about, right? Is that this pattern applies for workloads as well as for infrastructure itself. You can manage your clusters in the same way that you manage the workloads running in those clusters. So with GitOps, we have this concept of management cluster and leaf cluster, okay? The management cluster is basically where you're running the controllers that are requesting the creation of other clusters across numerous providers, right? And you're declaring the cluster in the same way that you would declare any other custom resource within Kubernetes. And this is something that is very, very powerful for hybrid scenarios. And the reason that it is so powerful is because we're using something called Cluster API, that it's another project by the CNCF. Matter of fact is, it's something that EKS Anywhere is also using to kind of like provision itself, to provision
Yeah, you jumped in. I was going to bring that up once we get to that stopping point where, yeah, in EKS Anywhere, we're using the Flux controller and we're using these management clusters as an option to say like, hey, if you want to manage these cluster states on-prem with GitOps and with infrastructure as code, like here you go. We're going to build it deep into EKS Anywhere and let you do that because we see it as a really good pattern, especially in some situations where you might be on-prem and not everything is defined as an API natively, and Kubernetes controllers can give you that declarative API that might be missing in some cases. So deploying into vSphere, there are APIs for it, but it's not necessarily like a Kubernetes spec. Using cluster API with Flux, absolutely, we can make that a manifest file and it can deploy your cluster for you.
Exactly, and it's all declarative, right? And the cool thing about it, and I think where you can kind of really start extracting value for hybrid, is how there's this clear boundary between cluster and provider, right? Because if you look at cluster API, and like you were just talking about, is it bare metal? Is it vSphere? Where is this really running, right? The underlying provider is going to require different actions to get to provide you with a cluster, right? But usually what you want, and this is towards reducing complexity and towards making sure that you can easier manage this large scale Kubernetes infrastructure, because like, honestly, like I don't think I've run into any probably real world scenario where you've got an organization doing hybrid and doing fleet scale, or doing hybrid without some form of fleet scale, right? We're talking about dozens, hundreds of clusters a lot of times, right? Like you probably don't have just one cluster in different locations. You're looking at much larger scale. So the fact that you want all those clusters to be as similar to one another, or as like Kevin was talking about, as blueprints, right? As that you want to be able to produce clusters that follow a given pattern. When you have this boundary between cluster and provider, it becomes very easy to do that, right? Because the cluster itself is just a description of the cluster, right? What version of Kubernetes you want, what CIDR range you want for your pods, how do you want to configure the cluster specifically, right? And you usually want to have some consistency across your clusters. You want to be able to change Kubernetes versions as easily as possible, which is something that kind of, when you're thinking about hybrid, becomes a challenge at scale. And the provider itself is separate from the cluster, right? Is what is going to be giving me my compute capacity? Where am I going to be deploying this cluster? And it will handle whatever specific actions it will need to take so that you can produce that cluster on top of heterogeneous, diverse underlying infrastructure, right? So it makes cluster something that is generally applicable, and it abstracts away the provisioning complexity. And I think this is when you look at hybrid, right, where you might have not one of these scenarios, but you might have many of those. You might be running some workloads on top of Kubernetes on vSphere, some others on bare metal, some others on AWS. You really, really want to make your life as simple as possible, right? And I think this boundary makes it very simple to declare your.
I mean, we've been talking about this all day on this show. Like the very first thing we started with was Docker shim being removed for a standard interface. We wanted the CRI interface that we said, hey, no, like we just need a clean way to describe a container to any runtime. We don't know what the runtime is going to be. It's literally how we started this day, was talking about Docker shim. And this is doing the same pattern. This is just a good infrastructure and code pattern to separate out those dependencies. And say like, hey, this is how a user declares it. This is what the thing is that uses it. And let's make an interface that everyone can agree on that can abstract some of those things, but also have additional details on, what is needed for specific configuration.
Exactly. For sure. And when you think about multi-tenancy, right? And when you think about kind of like workloads that are deployed to specific clusters because of underlying requirements, right? Whether you need direct access to some hardware, whether you need kind of like GPU access, all these different things. This decoupling of provider of infrastructure to cluster, right? And just the fact that using native Kubernetes constructs, you can customize and you can parameterize and you can templatize, right? All these things. It makes it very, very easy to reach scale while allowing extensibility and customizability of your configuration without like having massive repetition or just a lot of complexity in your pipelines or declarations, right? And I think when you take all that in, right, and you're thinking about this abstraction of complexity and how you can effectively decouple cluster from underlying provider, you can start thinking about kind of like the next level of operations that you're going to have to handle, right? And that's going to be, once you have created your cluster and once you have your hybrid architecture provisioned and deployed, that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? Now you really have to support this and you have to maintain this and you have to observe this, right? So this is another area where when you're thinking about hybrid, where you have workloads and clusters running in diverse locations, you really want to guarantee reliability as automated as possible. I think that's really the only way that you can effectively operate a platform at scale. And reliability has, well, with kind of the whole site reliability engineering momentum, we've evolved our thinking, right? Not from just availability, but you think about making sure that the experience that is expected by the user is what they're receiving, right? And you can start thinking about your kind of your error budgets and all these things, right? To me, the easiest way to reach that type of reliability at scale is through automation. And again, GitOps and Weave GitOps, because of this continuous process of reconciliation and the fact that you can effectively declare not just how your workload should operate, but how they should scale, how they should be distributed across environments and across clusters, how they should be secured, and how policy should be applied. You're making it a whole lot easier to achieve reliability at scale in diverse environments. I think that's kind of very, very powerful. And very
I think that also goes to scaling, not just the infrastructure piece, because scaling infrastructure, obviously, that's what most people talk about all the time, but scaling your teams and the people who manage it without having this sort of declarative single point of this is the state where people can look and understand what's going on. You end up with 3 different people running a command to apply something at the same time, or some way that like we don't have controls over. So you have to scale your team to make sure people can sleep at night, to make sure that this is reliable for the humans that are running the systems, and that team scales with scaling horizontally with more people, just the same way that your systems are scaling. And you need to have similar patterns to be able to say like, hey, everyone who manages this, let's go through this centralized repo. This is where the state is. This is how it's used. And then we can figure out with the controller and everything else, like how that gets applied and layered on top of it. Because Git has solved that problem for code bases a long time ago. Just like, hey, merge conflicts, everything that no one really likes dealing with. But how do we actually apply and build code reliably for, especially in open source, right? We have hundreds and thousands of people managing these code bases. And in the same way, we have to scale that side of it, of the process and the people. And GitOps is solving that problem on both sides of people being able to do stuff reliably and make sure that their commits make it in safely and don't override something else, but also the system scale and can be reliable for the applications that run on them as well.
Totally agree. And there's this kind of usual debate as to how does GitOps relate to DevOps, right? Is it a new DevOps? Is it kind of how does it relate? And I really think that, first of all, kind of going back to our first conversation, right? The fact that Open GitOps came out to define what GitOps is all about, I think it's very valuable so that we avoid kind of like this issue that I think we've experienced with DevOps, which is everybody has their own version of what DevOps is all about, right? And for some, it's just CI/CD. But there's a lot of nuances about kind of like agility and accelerated feedback cycles. And there's all these organizational, cultural things that are about DevOps that sometimes fall outside of kind of the view of organizations that are looking to adopt, right? To me, GitOps is a DevOps enabler, right? if you look at a lot of the objectives of DevOps, right, accelerating feedback cycles, continuous reconciliation is as fast of a feedback cycle as you can get, right? Removing boundaries and barriers between teams, right? Having a common workflow, having common tooling is an enabler to that, right? So I think what you're saying is absolutely right, right? It's a platform, it's a framework that allows teams to operate more reliably and to scale as humans and as organizations grow a whole lot easier. And I think that's, after all, like if you look at scale and if you look at complexity, right, what you're really looking to achieve is simplify, right? You want to make things easier. You want to get to that outcome with less work, right? And I think that's exactly what continuous reconciliation does, right? The fact that, and Kubernetes already does some of it, but that's why Weave GitOps is brings so much value on top of Kubernetes, because Kubernetes is already about reconciliation, right? There's a loop that's going on. You push something to the API, it puts it in the database, and there's just controllers that are always watching and updating the state of your runtime to match. What Weave GitOps provides is basically storing that state in a external single source of truth that is auditable, that is traceable, that you can secure. And if you think about hybrid, and you're looking at this diverse range of lots of clusters, the fact that you have the central location that they all pull from, I think simplifies access tremendously, right? It simplifies the creation of new environments tremendously, right? Because now you don't have to add more environments to push out to, right? And when you have these controllers running that are doing this continuous process of reconciliation, there's more things that you can react to, right? If you want to apply policy, if you want to secure, if you want to alert, if you want to notify, if you want to revert, if you want to have human gates, these are all things that you can use, you can accomplish, right, by having this engine running all the time. And this is basically super relevant when you're looking at large scale. You really don't want to have to be the human responsible for guaranteeing that things are operating. You want to leave that to agents. Like you want to have the robots do the work and just be notified when things need human attention, right?
Right. And the controller there is really merging that Kubernetes state for the machines to audit and the humans to be able to audit and view and have that human process as part of that full life cycle. And that's amazing because like people know how to deal with files on a computer. Like that's actually something we're really good at, is like we understand files. But like if you told me to go look at etcd and like try to figure out what's going on with the cluster and what changed, like no way, like that is machine readable. I shouldn't be accessing etcd directly and figuring out from what has happened in the cluster. But if you gave me a directory full of files, sure, I can look in that. I can grep it. I can understand what that file structure is, and it's something that is very familiar for a lot of people. And GitOps controller merging those two things of like, hey, the machines read this part, you read this part, and then we're going to make that thing happen is just a great way, a great interface for anyone using a Kubernetes cluster at scale.
Exactly. And there's with Weave GitOps, there's one element to GitOps that I hear as a pain point to some people, right? And it's the awareness of what is the current runtime state. Because I know what my desired state should look like. I can go and look at the repo, right? And I know there's an agent that is making sure that that's consistent with the runtime. But if I apply a new change, if I deploy a new version, if I release something, how do I know that it's deployed? How do I know where it is at in kind of like a multi-stage delivery process? Which is something that doesn't come by default, for example, with EKS, right? Like EKS or EKS Anywhere, you get Flux, but there's always this element of visibility that I think is very important for developers also, right? When you're developing applications and they need to be deployed to maybe multiple environments, or you're jumping through different infrastructure providers as your application is promoted through different stages, right? Maybe I'm using development in my AWS account, but for some reason I have to deliver production to a bare metal cluster, right? So having that visibility as to how my promotion is going on is something that you don't get. Kubernetes doesn't quite give you in a user-friendly way right off the box. And I think that's also where Weave GitOps provides a lot of value on top of EKS and on top of Kubernetes, because it allows you to see what's going on, right? To have clarity and to define actions that you want to take when deployments are ongoing, when things work and when things don't work, right? And this works great for disaster recovery, right? When you think about this large scale, this fleet of clusters, everything is in code, not just your workload, but your infrastructure, your clusters themselves are in code. So it becomes a whole lot easier to recover them if something goes wrong, to move them to a different provider if you have to, right? And we talked about this boundary between provider and cluster, right? So if, for example, due to disaster recovery scenarios, I have to move my clusters, move my workloads to a different provider, it becomes a whole lot easier, right? Maybe I need to move into a different region, even easier, right? Because this is only configuration that I have to push to my repositories, and it will make the necessary changes, right? And just the fact that you're pulling makes it all easier. Now, there's one thing about hybrid that a lot of quick people ask me, like we're talking about disaster recovery and high availability, but what about the data, right? Because it's a whole lot easier to move workloads to a new region, but if I lost the data, like what's that good, right? Like what is that doing for me? So I think it's very relevant to highlight that in even doing GitOps, for this type of scenario, like disaster recovery, high availability, you really still you need to apply data best practices, right? The cool thing is that if you're running your data pipelines as services in your cluster and you're declaring those workloads and deploying those workloads using GitOps, then it also becomes easier to define the patterns and deploy the tooling that is going to move that data around for you, right? So although you still have to think about data and the way that data has to be thought about, you can facilitate the process of moving that data around using GitOps, right? So I think for any scenario, we're looking at this large scale, we're looking at this hybrid environments where you have multiple clusters running in different locations. There's just so many. Your life is just going to be so much easier, and your team is going to be able to support that so much better if you use a tool like Weave GitOps and you follow the GitOps pattern for everything, your infrastructure and your applications. That it's basically just a game changer, right? It enables a whole new world of scalability and reliability.
And we're right about time for the segments, but I wanted to call out that if people are going to Kubecon, there is a whole GitOps Con conference that's the day before. So May 17th, if you're there in person, I do have a talk that I'm talking about. How I kind of scope this is I call it infrastructure as software instead of infrastructure as code. And so I have a talk there, but it's also virtual. So if anyone's interested in learning more about GitOps in general, this conference will have a ton of great talks and information about how people are using it, what tools they're using it with, and just basically how to get started and get structured. So say like, hey, if I want to get started going from traditional infrastructure as code with CI/CD, how do I move to this controller-based GitOps approach? And there's gonna be a ton of great talks. So go check out the schedule if anyone's interested.
Awesome. Yeah, and we're going to be there. WeaveWorks, look us up. We're going to have a booth, a Flux booth, and we're also going to be showing our Weave GitOps product. So we'd love to kind of show you around and see actually how this works live.
Yeah, it's going to be great. So thank you so much for joining. And we have another video break real quick.